Hey, Lark and Rose here. I'm going to make this video short and get right to offending people. I often hear people make the claim that the purpose of the Constitution was to protect individual rights. And I wanted there to be a video, this one, that I can point people to point out why that is utterly and completely provably false. And a lot of people were taught to believe that. I was taught to believe that. In fact, I may have actually said that. Maybe in those words, maybe not, 27 years ago when I was still a statist, but it's provably insane. The Constitution pretended to create a centralized federal government where there wasn't one before. Before the Constitution, there were the Articles of Confederation. Everybody in the debates, Federalists and Anti-Federalists, in the debates about the new Constitution, everybody agreed, there was no secret, there was no controversy, everybody agreed that the entire purpose of the new Constitution was to create a stronger, centralized federal authority. That is indisputable. The Articles of Confederation didn't really create any central authority. It was just sort of an agreement between the separate, smaller bunches of political parasites. The Constitution was absolutely designed to create power. Now, a lot of people focus on the Bill of Rights and say, well, that's the part that really matters. That's the things of, like, you can't do this, can't do that, the First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment, all that fun stuff. The Bill of Rights was not what the Federalists wanted. The people pushing the Constitution didn't want that. The Bill of Rights is a collection of amendments that was pushed by anti-Federalists who said, we're not going to go along with this at all unless you have some guarantees in there of some of the things it can't do. But what the Constitution did was create a centralized authoritarian ruling class. And it was supposed to be theoretically limited. Now, people like Patrick Henry very accurately predicted that it wouldn't be limited. It would quickly get worse than a king ever was, which it did. But it's weird that people think that the Bill of Rights is the Constitution. It's sort of like saying, well, I got this giant man-eating tiger and I let it go in your living room. But the purpose of that tiger is to keep you safe. You can tell because there's a little velvet muzzle on the nose of the tiger. Or there was. It fell off and now he's eating people. But the purpose of the tiger was to protect people. No, it wasn't. The purpose of the Constitution was to create a centralized authoritarian power. The supposed purpose of the Bill of Rights, which it completely failed to accomplish, was to stop that power from being abusive in certain ways. Article 1, Section 8 is a list of powers they pretended to give to the federal government, including Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes. It's allowed to rob people. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was no centralized taxing power. There was no centralized anything power. But to pretend that they created a thing that has the right to rob you and that the purpose of that thing is to protect you is insane. And I realize a lot of people are muddled in their heads between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and they sort of think of them as one big sort of thing that goes together, and they think of the Founding Fathers as one big group that all thought alike. They didn't. Most of the people most responsible for the actually coherent, legitimate ideas that backed the Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, they were against the Constitution because they recognized it was going to be an authoritarian disaster. Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry very vocally were against the Constitution because they saw that it was creating a centralized authority that was going to turn into an uncontrollable beast. And then it did. But the fact that people skip over the whole, we're making a centralized power with a president and a House and a Senate and all these rules for how it works and all these powers we're pretending to give it. And we're just going to look at the Bill of Rights and say, well, the whole point of this is the amendments at the end that were supposed to keep the man-eating tiger a little bit more in line. No, that's just not reality. The Constitution is anti-freedom. It is pro-authoritarian control and anti-freedom, and it is a direct betrayal of the ideas expressed in the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, whenever any government becomes destructive of individual rights, it is the right and duty of the people to alter or abolish it. I could go for that, although I might point out that literally the moment something is government, it's violating individual rights, because that's the inherent nature of government. But other than that little detail, I agree completely. What does the Constitution say? Constitution says that Congress has the right to call out the militia to quell insurrections. In other words, when you say, hey, we think you're getting out of line, the Constitution empowers them to send armed people to kill you. That's not pro-freedom. That's anti-freedom. That's pro-authoritarian control. And the fact that the Bill of Rights was supposed to be the velvet muzzle on the tiger, which doesn't actually do anything, doesn't mean that was the purpose of the tiger. The purpose of the Constitution was to create a centralized federal power. That nobody had any illusions about that when the debates were going on between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. It's not a pro-freedom document. And what's really sad is because Americans go through this indoctrination, and so did I, is they're so oblivious they don't realize that you can go to the Constitution of North Korea and find the Bill of Rights in it. And all the lovely things it says about people have the right to vote, and they have the right to be secure in this, and they're allowed to do this, and they have all these freedoms. Of course, they get violated on a daily basis, even like way worse than happens here. So, does anybody want to point at the Constitution of North Korea and say, the purpose of the Constitution of North Korea is to protect individual rights? I don't think anybody is insane enough to make that claim. But you're making a parallel claim that's just as ridiculous if you believe that and say that about the U.S. Constitution. It created an authoritarian ruling class. It was theoretically supposed to be relatively tiny and limited, which failed completely, and it grew to something way beyond any level of authoritarianism that King George ever could dream of, literally. So, yeah, stop imagining that the Constitution is pro-freedom. It's not in any way. There's a piece of it that was supposed to limit the power it was creating, and that piece was not the idea of the people who wrote the Constitution. It was the idea of the people who opposed the Constitution and said, this is going to be a disaster, so you better at least say, you're not allowed to tell us what we can say, you're not allowed to disarm us, you're not allowed to do random searches of us, you're not allowed to do all these things, and, 9th and 10th Amendment, you're only allowed to do the things that this Constitution specifically authorizes you to do. And the 9th and 10th Amendments were totally thrown out the window many, many years ago, and almost everything the federal government does is way beyond its constitutional power. Now, the people who still worship the Constitution as if it's pro-freedom say, well, it wasn't supposed to be this. Well, that's true. What we have now is nothing like what it describes, but this was going to happen, and Patrick Henry knew it before the Constitution was even, agreed on. They were still debating it, and Patrick Henry was already accurately predicting all the ways it would go horribly awry. And then it did. And he was absolutely right. So, I think there's a tendency, now to be a little bit nice and sympathetic towards those people, there's a tendency for everybody to muddle in their heads the Founding Fathers as if it was one group of people and they all believed the same thing. No, they didn't. Some were opportunistic politicians, and some were actually trying to push concepts of freedom, like Thomas Paine and his pamphlet Common Sense was pretty damn close to being an anarchist document, and things that Patrick Henry said, and not that they were all, they would make excuses for government. None of them were overtly anarchists, although they got pretty close. And then you had opportunistic politicians who were like, well, after we get away from that king, maybe we can cash in and grab some power. That's what the Constitution was. It was opportunists cashing in on the opportunity to grab power for themselves and disguising it as, we're doing this for the people, which is the same BS propaganda that the Constitution of North Korea uses. The Constitution of the Soviet Union used the same garbage and had a Bill of Rights. Constitution of the Weimar Republic, which became Nazi Germany, had a Bill of Rights, used all the same BS. Constitution of Communist China, the most murderous regime in the history of the world. Same thing. You can go read them. And then unless you can tell me that the purpose of those constitutions was to protect individual rights, you need to stop repeating that ridiculous line when it comes to the U.S. Constitution, because that was not the purpose. That was something that in a failed effort, the anti-federalists tried to tack on at the end, and they got it tacked on, but it didn't do anything. They just ignore it. And so to be muddled in your head about the Constitution and the ideas of individual freedom as if they go together is a fine way to accidentally be a promoter of statism without noticing it, because you didn't bother to go in and go, wait a minute, what's with this Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes? Like, you can't really pretend that saying he has the right to rob you is about protecting your freedom. No, it isn't. That's empowering him and disempowering me. Obviously, in the most direct, clear, blatant way you possibly could. So I would urge people, instead of just thinking the founders and the founding documents, actually read them and read the debates between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists and realize that the Federalists were wrong in every single one of their predictions and assurances, and the Anti-Federalists were right in every single one of their dire predictions and their concerns about this new Constitution creating an authoritarian monster, even worse than the state monsters. And it totally did. And you can say, well, it wasn't done right. But guess what that sounds like? Well, that wasn't real constitutional republic because they did it wrong. Well, that wasn't real communism because they did it wrong. If every single time you try a democratically elected constitutional republic with a Bill of Rights, which includes the United States, Soviet Union, North Korea, Nazi Germany, Red China, if every time you try it in the real world, the outcome is horrendous authoritarian power and the abuse of individual rights, maybe the premise is bogus, and the premise is bogus. The premise of the Constitution is absolutely anti-freedom and bogus and illegitimate. And a number of things that some of the founding fathers said were dead on because they were critical of that authoritarian crap, and they recognized this is a betrayal of the Declaration of Independence. It's not a continuation of it. It's a complete about-face. And that's what the Constitution actually is. It's a pro-authoritarian, anti-freedom betrayal of the concepts expressed in the Declaration of Independence by the people back then who, to one degree or another, actually were trying to promote freedom. And if you're confused in your head about that and you pass on that confusion and keep telling people that the Constitution is pro-freedom, you're just reinforcing the mythology that makes them think that the current regime stomping all over us is somehow legitimate. It's not. And if you ever want to all the way understand in a very thorough, specific way why the Constitution was absolutely illegitimate from day one, read No Treason, The Constitution of No Authority by Lysander Spooner. If you can read that and come out the other side and say, yeah, the Constitution is great, I will be both disturbed and impressed that your brain could still hang on to a belief that is that provably insane. The Constitution is the enemy of humanity and freedom, as is the Constitution of every ruling class that has one.